For those of you, especially if you've taken the SAT, is completely different. So we're really excited to hear what Noah has to say. Take it away, Noah.
Hi guys, it is Thursday, our final session, and thank you all for joining me. And we are here today to discuss the ACT Science, which, like Kayla said, is sort of the weirdest section across the SAT or ACT. There's nothing like it on the SAT. And it's really sort of an amalgamation of all of the different skills that we're working on across the other sections. So let's dive right in. The science test always appears last, and it's 35 minutes to do 40 questions. So this, in some way, rather than best for last, it's often sort of the hardest as last, and it's the fastest as last. So this is something to take into consideration because your student has been working for several hours already and now has to step up to the plate and try to deal with this weird section. So that's definitely a conversation worth having with your student because that's a predictable evil. There are 6 or possibly 7 passages on this test that each consist of 100 to 300 words, and most of them have either tables or charts or diagrams or things of that sort to take up space and to provide more information. Each passage is then followed by a question set containing 5 to 8 questions. So this is often the hardest section, the section that kids don't know how to prepare for, and sort of because of that, it's also the hardest section to tutor for. Not only because of the depth, it tests all of the natural sciences from biology, chemistry, earth science, and physics. The bad news about this test is that the student will likely see information, material that they've never learned before and they're unfamiliar with. And that's where a lot of students get tripped up. The good news, though, is that the ACT science test really doesn't test your knowledge of science. If it is, it's asking sort of basic, straightforward questions that a high school student would have seen, like to go between Fahrenheit and Celsius and things of that sort. So the primary skills that this test is looking for is the ability to read charts and graphs and extract information from them. That's like the problem-solving section of the math and its correspondent, or on both the SAT and the ACT. The ability to locate information quickly and draw inferences from the information in the passages, charts, and graphs to answer questions. There will be some basic math, but it's really arithmetic that isn't difficult to do. You don't have the calculator on the test and you don't need a calculator. The emphasis is not on math, but sometimes you need the math to synthesize what you're seeing in the paragraph or in the chart. Now, the more of an understanding of science the student has, the better, but it's not necessary. It's really a reading comprehension test rather than what knowledge you bring into it. However, if you are familiar with the particular concept, then it's just all about familiarity and sort of how quickly you can move through the material. Like I said, you do not need to have a good understanding of the passage or the science contained in it to get all the questions that accompany an ACT science passage right. For most students, 35 minutes seems like too little time to answer 40 questions based on 6 to 7 passages with multiple graphs and diagrams. Students are likely to feel the most time pressure of any of the ACT sections on the science. And a reminder, it's also the last section they see. So because of this time pressure, pacing strategies come into play more on this section than any of the others. It's important for the student to start to recognize and do the easiest passages and the easiest questions in those passages first. Like the rest of the test, you never want to leave a question blank. At the very least, randomly guess. Ideally, eliminate a few options so you're making an educated guess, but never leave anything blank. Because the time pressure, this is the section where you'll most often have conversations with the students of if they can't get through all of it, what is their number they need to get this type of score they want to see. So I included some of the top scores here. You need a 37 to 40 questions right to get anywhere from the 31 to 36. So that means that really all of those students have to be getting through basically all of the sections if they want to see a score in that range. And then it tapers off as we go further and further. If a student is aiming for a top score in the ACT science test, they should spend about 4 minutes on each 5-question passage, about 5 minutes on each 6-question passage, about 6 minutes on each 7-question passage, and so on and so forth. Learning to work at this speed does take practice, but that's why the ACT is particularly more helpful than the SAT, in that there are more released official exams, and they've changed less over time than the SAT is, so there are just more sections that you can drill with your student. So now diving into the types of passages you'll see. There's 3 different types contained in 2 broader categories, and we're going to take a look at the first 2, which are under the topic of data analysis. So the first is data interpretation, and this tests the ability to interpret data in charts, tables, graphs, and diagrams. They start with a brief introduction that explains the subject under study, but they don't mention experiments. They simply present data in tables and graphs and ask questions about that data. Next is research summary, and these passages contain research summaries of various studies or experiments. They also begin with an introduction and then describe 2 or more experiments or studies along with research in tables and graphs. They test the ability to understand science experiments and interpret experimental results. Since the results are often presented in tables and graphs, your data analysis skills are also important. So those are the first 2. And then the final one is called the conflicting viewpoints passage, which it seems self-explanatory, but it requires you to compare and contrast 2 or more scientists or students or theoretical viewpoints that offer conflicting interpretations on some scientific phenomenon or event. This passage will be followed by 6 to 8 questions that test your ability to understand different scientific viewpoints and recognize the similarities and differences between them. This is usually the longest passage in terms of words on the science test, but it also tends to have the fewest graphs, and sometimes it has none. Now, there are a lot of students who, because you might have interacted with math students who are totally turned off by word problems. Sort of the same thing. There are students who are stressed out by taking this test, so they think that, oh, the graphs are the worst part. So students who are drawn to this passage mistakenly think that this is an easier part because there are few graphs and it's all words. But the reality is that it's often the hardest and the most time-consuming passage. So again, if a student does great with it, then you don't need to suggest anything, but it's my typical recommendation that you identify this passage and you leave it for the last one, so you can try and get through as many other passages as possible. It is worth discussing some of the recent changes to the ACT science. It's not recent in the last year or so, but just as a trend. For many years, the science test had a rigid formula where there were 3 data representation passages with 5 questions each, 3 research summary with 6 questions, and 1 conflicting viewpoint. But since 2015, even though there are still 40 questions, there are more often 6 passages than 7, with each of the respective passages getting 1 more question than in the past. So just to summarize, there's typically 12 to 16 questions for data representation, 18 to 22 for research summary, and 6 to 8 for the conflicting viewpoints. So as the ACT has gained popularity, as I mentioned in the past, the SAT has been changing to be more like the ACT because it's become more popular. And because of this, students have gotten better at preparing for the science test. And because of this, students were doing better than the ACT curve would allow. And so it sort of puts this undue pressure on the number of questions you get right. And that is why you can only miss 2 or 3 questions to be in that 31 to 36 range. But that said, the ACT writers have attempted to address this problem by now, including a few questions that actually test science knowledge. This sort of drives a lot of people crazy because now it suggests they have to go through flashcards and sort of like SAT vocabulary type things. That's really not the case. It is typically only 2 or 3 questions. And again, it's not like a super deep, high level concept you need to understand. It's something that the students should have interacted with during their time in high school. So getting into the different ways to approach the passages. In general, the difficulty of a passage is closely related to the number and or complexity of figures or tables it contains. they usually aren't giving you superfluous graphs where it's just the same information said in a different way. And so because of that, since it's forcing you to get your information from different sources, it often takes more time and requires more synthesis. So typically the best way to dive into the problems is to look for the data analysis passages with 1 or 2 tables, and then the data analysis passages with 3 or more tables, and then to go on to that viewpoints passage. But that said, if a student sees a passage that he's familiar with the concepts, it's worth doing that first, even if it violates the rules. Just because if I just talked about kinetic energy or something in physics, and I understand what that 1/2 mv square, if I understand the materials there, it saves just that much time in making the connections you need to make for the questions. So if something's familiar, do that. In terms of timing, more than the reading, more than anything else, you should not spend your time reading the passage and then doing the questions. You should look at the introduction, which will frame what the experiment or what the passage is about, and then go directly to the questions. You can familiarize yourself with the graphs and parts of the passage as needed to answer the questions. So you look at the questions, you say, what information do I need? And then you go into the sections and look exactly for that info. And typically the steps there are to review the introduction and identify the subject matter and whatever possible variables they might be discussing. Typically important terms are italicized, and it's worth underlining or for the student to take note of it. And then you want to locate the data that will allow you to answer the question. You want to learn to skim the passage for the key phrase in the question, and it's very often that you will only need to read the sentence in the passage that contains the key phrase to get the answer. So it really is like a word search. You look at the questions, okay, this word, this phrase, find it in the passage, and very often that's all you have to do. So diving into more general skills, the most important skill for this section is the ability to read charts, graphs, and diagrams, and then to synthesize them. If there is one type that keeps giving the student trouble, it's worth doing an in-depth lesson and trying to cull as many questions on that as possible, because it's likely that the same types of graphs appear across these tests. So it's worth nipping one in the bud if that's giving the student particular issues. Questions they should always have in mind are, what is the subject matter? What is the dependent variable? What's the independent variable? And are there any controls? On the topic of science jargon or vocabulary, I think it's one of those good tutor as shrink moments to tell the student that they don't need to be intimidated. No high school student will be familiar with all of the concepts on the ACT science section, and you don't need to be familiar with them to answer most of the questions. But you do need to know the difference between like-sounding terms. So if a student thinks meiosis is mitosis, that might get them into trouble. But again, this really shouldn't require flashcards and all of that. What science information you bring to the test makes life easier just because you've seen it before and it's less exotic, but really is not necessary to get the questions right. It's really a word search and about comprehension. You always want to remind yourself and the student that the questions are typically much simpler than the passage itself. Just because you don't understand the concepts and what the passage is talking about doesn't mean that you need that overarching understanding to really answer the questions. So what types of questions are there and which to do first? Sort of similar to the English grammar sections on the ACT and the SAT. Questions go from localized to sentences to broader and conceptual about the whole work. So it goes sort of from sentence to paragraph to whole passage. So looking at the most localized are lookup questions, which make up about 8 or 9 of the 40 and simply require you to look up answers in the tables or graphs of a passage. It's really, what's it looking for? Here it is, boom, that's the answer. It may ask for data from 2 different tables, but most of them are just about, look at this graph, extract this piece of information from that graph. The next level up is spotting trends, which makes up another 8 or 9 questions. And that asks you to synthesize several points in the data. You may be asked to come up with a value that is between or beyond the values in the tables. Or you might be asked what the data in the table might look like if it were graphed. Next up are inference questions, which are 9 or 10 of them total. And just like the reading test, these questions may require you to draw conclusions, sometimes by putting pieces of information together. Some ask for broad conclusions that can be extrapolated, while others ask for small ones that follow from the passage. Usually you don't have to infer too much. Like the reading section, if you have to make several degrees in your logic to get to the point, then that's rarely the answer. It's how can you move one step with certainty from the question to the answer? And that's typically the correct one. So now looking at some of the harder types of questions, scientific method questions only make up 5 or 6 total, but they're typically some of the hardest because it requires the closest reading of the passage as well as an understanding of what the scientific method is. It's forcing the student to sort of reconcile with the structure of how the experiment was put together and to ask their opinions of what was improper. They usually aren't as difficult as they appear, but they require the most engagement with the material. The other type is the conflicting viewpoints, which we've talked about, which is 6 to 8 questions. And the reason why it's difficult is because there are fewer tables and different theories or explanations, and it forces the student to have to pick and choose what's right. Typically, very long questions tend to be harder than short ones. And so depending on your student and how they're doing on time, if there's a lot of words, it's a relatively safe bet that you can tell them, okay, skip that, come back to it later, get through all of the points that you know that you can get. Because again, this is the most time-pressured test. So if the reality is that your student doesn't have the time to get through all of the questions, and almost certainly doesn't have time to get through all of the questions and then to check them, they really should be spending their focus time rather than their rushing time at the very end on the points that they can reasonably get. So with that, if a question confuses, skip and answer the rest of the questions in the set, because there are times where if I've answered 5 of the questions and then go back to one of them, something in one of the answers might have given me a fuller understanding and recontextualize that problem. So if you are going to put off questions in a set, it's typically good to put it off until you finish that set, look back at it. If it seems like you can do it now. If it seems like it's going to take more effort to sort of to open it back up and do it, then move on to the other sections. But again, never leave it blank. So some of the advanced strategies for the science test, you don't necessarily have to pass this on to your student, but it's good for the tutor to be aware. If a question is hard, apart from the timing of it, it's because it requires actual science knowledge, which is only a couple of the questions. They involve numerous or difficult diagrams that throw a lot of buzzwords to try and throw the student off. Or it requires an understanding of the scientific method, which I have listed here. You have to observe a phenomenon, hypothesize an explanation for the phenomenon, make a prediction based on your hypothesis, design an experiment that will test the prediction, modify the hypothesis if necessary based on experiment results. So these types of questions are going to ask the student that typically there's going to be something wrong or incongruous in the passage, and it's going to ask the student to identify which aspect of the scientific method needs to be addressed to fix that issue. And the last type is the conflicting viewpoint sections. Some tips for that section. It's a double-edged sword because I'm really not a huge science person, but I find that these are more interesting passages, which can be deceiving because the student might want to dive into that first because it seems more bearable, but they usually are more time sensitive because there's more words, fewer diagrams, harder questions to engage in, and it's always one of the longer sections. So step 1 for tackling these problems is to read the first theory that's presented and then answer any questions referred to that theory. It's the same concept of starting smaller and getting bigger as you go. So you read the first theory, you answer those questions, then you do the same thing with the second theory, the third theory, so forth, and you answer each of those questions. And then you go back and answer any of the remaining questions that typically offer you to go in between those theories. So once you've answered the questions and built up the foundation of what each theory is talking about, then is when I would suggest to go into the ones that intertwine them. And by taking one theory at a time and answering only questions that relate to that theory, you are less likely to confuse the differing views. This is also the best way of grabbing points under last-minute pressure. So I think what I have next here are just, I'm not going to go through all of the terms, but I have a couple of pages of the types of terms that do come up on the test. Again, if you have time with it, it's a time-sensitive test, and it's also time-sensitive how much time you have with the student. So if you're starting months and months in advance, and the student is the type that really wants to hit these types of concepts hard, I'm just going to scroll back and forth, and I'll leave them up so you can see them all. But you can see some of them are straightforward and they should know already, Celsius or cell membrane. And then there's things like covalent bonds, where again, the science test is not going to ask, like, here's a picture, which of these is a covalent bond? It's not going to do that. But if I'm reading a passage and I'm stressed and I'm tired because it's the end of the science section, and I see words that are familiar to me, then it's just less of a barrier to getting through the material, to understanding the material and getting those questions correct. So again, to reiterate, don't feel the pressure that you have to go through and study all of these terms. It's far easier with the science sections, or with the math sections rather, to sort of go through the concepts it's far easier to teach math as it pertains to these tests than it is to teach science. So if a student is hungry to practice, these are the types of words that I've found to be helpful to understand. But again, there is no pressure to, be going through worksheets and testing them just on vocabulary. So that is the science section, and I would be happy to take questions on science or math or the SAT or anything people might have.
I do have one or two questions about the science section so far.
Sure.
Okay. So I often hear, well, first of all, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, based on what you've just kind of gone over, this really seems like the most strategy section for critical thinking. It doesn't really, as you've mentioned and pointed out, it's not really science content. It's not really math content. It's just sort of,
right.
some critical thinking topics. And I guess I'm wondering, I often hear tutors say that this is the most learnable section. And is that because it's so strategy heavy, or because it's skills that students really do already have, or none of the above?
So I think it's sort of the one that benefits from the most rigorous, like, drilling. We're going to go through just section after section of it, because again, I ended on vocabulary, but this is the test that you sort of bring the least amount of knowledge in. Whereas math, you have to know, you have strategies for all of them, yes. But on grammar, you have to know grammar. On math, you have to know math. On reading, it's similar types of reading comprehension to this, but there's more time. The time element is what makes this section the most like a game, and I guess in that sense, the most practicable. So yeah, I think time would be better be spent on, let's see if we can get through this passage in 3.5 minutes or something, rather than going through flashcards of xylem and phloem and water cycle. So sort of, if one job of the tutor is to help you head shrinker and get all of the outside anxiety out of the way, the other main job of a test prep tutor is to make things as like game day scenarios as possible. So if you're a baseball player and you're swinging with 2 bats, when you go up to the plate with 1 bat, theoretically you're going to swing it harder and faster. So because this science test is really so specific to this test. It's not about outside information. It's about the game of answering these questions within this amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I think people would say it's the most practicable or learnable, because it's really just a specific set of skills.
Got it. And so to that end, if you had a student who, I don't know if as a tutor this happens that often, but a student who's just starting in their process and they're not sure if they're leaning towards the SAT or the ACT, maybe they've taken 2 diagnostics and gotten similar scores. What role do you think the science section plays in that determination?
I think it plays a pretty fair type of, you'll usually see a correlation between science score and reading comprehension. So it's really about, if the student doesn't like science, isn't good at science, then I typically try to stay away from it. If they do great on everything else, then typically they have the skills to succeed on science. I think the other thing to look at is math, because on both the SAT and ACT, you have some form of reading comp, you have some form of grammar. And the SAT has their sort of weird reading comprehension science subscore. Not that colleges really care about that, but I guess it also depends on the student and what they're trying to demonstrate. If it's a science kid, I don't think like, oh, I'm a science kid, I have to take the ACT because there's a science section, because whatever you're trying to demonstrate to a college in that respect would either be shown by APs or subject tests or things of that like. So it's sort of hard to prescribe anything based on one section alone, but rather to look in at, like, if a student is horrible at math, then it might be worth the stress of taking the ACT, because the math is only a quarter of the overall thing versus half of the 1600 score.
Right.
So yeah, you have to look at it in all, but yeah, it's if they're decent at reading comprehension, I think they can learn the skills to do it, because so many kids think, understandably, that they have to read the whole passage and then do the questions. It's a little more foreign to do that with the reading section straight up, to just go to the questions and skim through. That's not as recommended, but that really is the primary strategy that I used when I took it, and I found to be the most helpful for students, is to just extract the information they need for those questions rather than answering the whole or understanding the whole thing first.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And it's kind of, all of this makes me think a lot about the really just role of timing in all of this. And, I wonder, I don't know, do you ever find it hard as a tutor to really explain to students that, like, I don't know if I'm expressing this correctly, how do you instill the sort of value of a test that's so much based on timing and ability to, if students had, 8 hours to do this test, I'm sure they would do very well.
Right. Yeah. The point of the ACT, the operative element of it is time. And I guess you could say that for any standardized test, but that's really what they're ratcheting up. If you had more time, like what makes ACT math difficult, in my opinion, is the time. If you had more time, it would be far easier than the SAT math, I think. So for me, I'm also relatively, my usual method of working with students is I acknowledge that I'm not that much older than them. So I'm not trying to be, officious. And I'm relatively cynical about these tests anyway. So for me, the more that students think of this as a puzzle or a game, I think for a number of reasons, is if it's framed in the right way, reducing it to that is helpful for reducing all of the outside stress of like, oh, this number dictates the rest of my life and all of that. But it also helps them buckle down and like a crossword or a Sudoku puzzle. It's like, okay, or any of those games, like here are the strategies, here are the little shortcuts. here are the cheat codes. Are any of them so like, there's no secrets of like, put, BD, like those are the answers.
Right.
But students have had, like, whether they've taken a bunch of standardized tests or not, they really haven't spent time on that meta test awareness. And they think that the testers are out to get them. And so if you can reframe that as, no, the testers are out to get people who make the obvious mistakes, then that gives them an awareness of, oh, here's this pothole and I'm gonna walk around it rather than walk into it.
Right. No, I think that's really helpful. And that kind of shifts. My next question is it's more general. And
Okay.
It's about sort of your experience as a tutor. For our viewers watching this, let's say they become really confident with the excellent strategies you've helped them, come to see. They've taken some time, they've studied the content. How do you typically actually structure your sessions and your lessons? How do you ensure that students work hard outside of your limited time together? And what are just some more, general tutoring approaches you take to doing this test if you're fully armed to teach it?
Yeah. So again, it depends how much time you have with a student. If, I'm in New York City, so there are, like many of you are probably, so there's like test prep season. You're getting some students where you're working with them for 6 months. That's a different ball game than if you're working with someone to raise the score after taking it one time and you're with them for 3 months or 8 weeks or something like that. Again, the benefit of the ACT versus the SAT is that there are more official materials that exist and the test has changed less, particularly the science section. Over the last, like an ACT from 2008 isn't as outdated as an SAT from 2008. No. So I really like so with regard to the science test, I like to just drill them sections, section after section. With the SAT or ACT, I like to hit on all of the sections, assuming, like, if it's a student who's getting 750s on English and 600s on math, obviously we're going to spend more time on math. But I think it's worthwhile to keep things fresh in the session. I usually work for an hour and a half because I think that that's enough time to review whatever homework was given and to hit the 2 or 3 or 4 different sections you want to discuss in that day. But I primarily like to work when I'm with them and assigning when I'm not with them to work off of real tests. Ideally, they are timing themselves. And particularly for the ACT, I do think it's helpful to be doing timed exercises with them. So even if you are, there have been times where I'm lying a little to the student and I'm giving you 7 minutes and I'm really giving them 6 minutes. So when I say you have a minute left, I'm lying a little bit, but it's the same concept as just swinging with multiple bats. It's if they can do well under the pressure given, or ideally under an artificial pressure that's more intense that you've set, then they'll be fine on game day. It's really just exposing them to the terms and conditions they're going to see, so it feels second nature. Like if an actor has memorized his lines and can do them in his sleep, that gives him more room to sort of play underneath the words and to focus on things other than memorizing them. So similarly, if a student, I know what section is second and what's third, and I know all the structure, and I know if I have the little hierarchy of strategies in my head, the more that they can just sort of build that spreadsheet in their mind of tools to pull from, the better equipped they'll be on test day.
Right. And do you think, aside, from the homework that you assign, is there a recommended amount of time that you would tell a student to spend studying outside of lessons?
Again, it depends on how much, so how far away is test date? I think an ideal scenario, which isn't always the case just because you're dealing with juniors, you're dealing with seniors, these are busy kids apart from this, and just the reality is that they don't always put in the time they need, but 2 to 3 hours a week is
Mm.
ideal. Some students do more. Of course, you can always do more. At some point, there definitely is overkill. But it's the biggest factor is about familiarity going into the test. And
Yeah.
it's important that the student is thinking about this test, not just the 1 or 2 times they're meeting with you a week, but that they're starting to, that it's a constant. On one hand, you don't want them thinking too much. On the other hand, you don't want them compartmentalizing their thoughts about the test. There should be sort of a fluid, connective process building in terms of strategies and content, and to set them up for the best chance at success.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's really, really, really helpful. I don't know, just to end on sort of a happy note, do you have any examples or stories of maybe one student that you just saw a complete transformation?
Yeah, I think the reality has been that when it comes to test prep, I feel good about doing it because I remember how stressful these tests were. And I think you're doing a mitzvah for the kid to help them get through that process. That said, the tutor can do a lot. I don't want to downplay that. But the tutor can't fault him or herself for, the student is the student. And even if you're working for 6 months, like if you have 6 months with a student who's not a reader and doesn't have strong reading comprehension, you can work on that. But odds are, if they aren't already, then the infrastructure at home with parents and things like that isn't already in place. And so it is possible to introduce and reinforce good behaviors that over time can change the student in that respect. But if there's a student who's eager to work hard early on, whose scores aren't where it's at, those are more often the students who I've been able to see 200 to 50 point rises out of. And that's not with, they were working 8 hours a week apart from us, but it's that, they took notes when there was a they were organized. They did more. The student always has to do more of the heavy lifting than the tutor. So if the student has those personality traits, if their score isn't where it's at, it's likely that you can work with them to get it there. If you're dealing with a student whose scores aren't where it's at and they're lazy and not interested in whatever, at a certain point you can't give up on them. You have to find the ways to work with them, but you can't blame yourself if they're not putting in the work. There's only so much that you can do, and it's crucial that they are working apart from their work with you.
Got it. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's very helpful. And it's helpful, especially when communicating with parents and families about realistic expectations,
Right. Exactly.
and what to expect. That's all I have right now, but I just want to, thank you again and commend you.
Yeah,
These
of course.
notes are incredibly thorough and organized and really helpful for everyone at home. And, hoping that you're willing to just, be kind of a resource moving forward for any of our tutors who might have questions offline, since it's been hard to get everyone live.
Not a problem.
All right. Thanks again, Noah. And thank you to everyone at home. We will be following up by email with instructions for our diagnostic exams that you will be taking.